Brought to you by CGTN Europe.
Hello, I'm Stephen Cole. Welcome to the Agenda podcast. And this week, we're looking at who's going to foot the bill as a new report, The State of Finance for Nature, suggests we need to triple the amount of investment in nature-based solutions by 2030 if we're going to save the planet. I spoke to one of the authors of the report, Justin Adams, Director of Nature-Based Solutions at the World Economic Forum, and asked him just what state the natural world was in right now.
The state is inadequate. I mean, the state is poor. We are investing 0.1% of GDP, so 1/10 of 1% of GDP, about $133 billion per year, is invested in nature, and it is dramatically lower than it needs to be, given that actually nature underpins about half of global GDP. So many sectors are highly or mostly dependent on a healthy planet, and yet we know from climate change, from ecological collapse, our environmental indicators are in decline, and yet we are investing this 1/10 of 1% of global GDP into nature-positive activities.
And you want to see investment in nature-based solutions tripled by, 2030? That's quite close. It's 9 years away. Is that feasible?
From where we're starting from, it's clearly a stretch. But I think more importantly is to think about how much money is already invested into these sectors. Our food, our agriculture, and beverage sector is about $8 trillion per year, right? So that is the economic output of that sector. And yet that sector is absolutely dependent on healthy nature. So how can we actually shift the investment that's going into that sector to actually make more nature positive outcomes? And that's what we've got to start thinking about, rather than just nature investments as somehow a separate thing. So we're talking about a tripling over that time. At the same time, every year, we're investing $600 billion per year on agricultural subsidies, many of which are actually driving environmental decline. So how could we shift those as just one example of how we can get to some of this mobilization of new resource that we know is so desperately needed?
And I suppose you want to change the percentage balance. At the moment, 86% from public funds and the remainder from private finance. So would you like to see that balance change and more money come from private finance?
Absolutely. I mean, I started working in the climate field over 20 years ago, and it was a much more nascent field. It's now a field that, in this report, we talk about 700+ billion of investment in climate. More than half of that is from private sector. In contrast, our investment into nature at $133 billion per year, 86% of that is coming from government, from the public sector. So a much smaller percentage from private sector. And so if we've learned from the climate and how we're starting to tackle and starting to ramp up efforts on climate change, it's about government working with private sector and doing that in several different ways, but creating policy an incentive that encourages and crowds in private sector capital. We're seeing the interest and awareness growing from the private sector, but not yet the means of how they could deploy that type of capital at the scale that's required.
So how do you persuade them to put more money in? Is that through shareholders? Because it's the shareholders who want to see returns, and they wouldn't automatically see a return on their money, would they?
I think if we look at the finance sector, as I say, awareness is growing that their investments make a real difference. And the two key things that we need to do in terms of how the finance sector allocates its capital, the first is have more transparency about current allocation and the impacts that allocation is having. So how do we actually start tracking the negative investment or the negative impacts that so much money is going into these sectors today? And how do we then start scaling back investments that are actually driving nature negative activities? And how can we then start creating opportunities for where investors can allocate money to nature positive opportunities? And that's what we've got to start seeing scaled up.
Your report says biodiversity loss could be stopped for a cost of $203 billion a year. Do you detect that the world is moving towards acceptance of something like that figure?
I think
especially, as you say, in the midst of a COVID crisis.
There's a bigger shift that needs to occur. I think the awareness of the twin environmental crises has probably never been greater, but I think there's still a tendency that we treat environment as somehow a nice to have or a fringe activity that just the environmental NGOs, the environment community is going to take care of. And I think that's also where we fall down in terms of thinking, well, that's where we're going to allocate capital to actually get the increase in investment that we need. And it's not that, it's actually about how do we retool our economy so that we are not driving such destructive practices that we're seeing, that is driving such a decline in nature. And that's, I think, what people have to start. That's the shift that's got to be there. This is an integral way of how we're going to build our economy for the future. If nature underpins half of global GDP, yet we're only currently allocating 0.1% of global GDP to actually nature positive investment. I mean, on the one hand, that's a wonderful return. We invest a tiny amount, and yet it underpins half of the global economy. And so, how can we actually think about that in a different, a new way? So that's where I see hope, and that's where I see opportunity for shifting the conversation. But we are a long way from that today.
Well, 2021 is a big year, a big green year, of course, with Kunming, climate change, Glasgow. What needs to be agreed at those meetings, do you think, if we're going to meet the goals and the targets that have been set? Sometimes these conferences, these congresses can develop, as you know, into talking shops, a great deal of hot air, which is damaging in itself, but without concrete results, but a lot of promises.
So I think this is 2021 is dubbed the super year for nature, because as you say, we've got this critical biodiversity summit happening in China now in October of this year. We've then got the climate summit hosted in the UK in November. We've also got the UN Food System Summit, the first time we're having a food system summit in September, hosted by the UN Secretary General. And the food system is the biggest driver of nature loss. How we produce our food is the biggest driver of loss. So bringing those three events together, it's absolutely crucial that world leaders step up, recognize the scale of the challenge, and commit to targets about how we are going to address it. And we've had targets before, so it's not just targets, but it's then follow through. And I think the two key things that we need to be following through with is an agreement around transparency and reporting. There's the old adage, we can only manage what we measure. And so we've got to start measuring and reporting on progress in a much more transparent way. One of the things we found with this report, it's so difficult to actually pull out so much of the data to be able to comment on the state of nature financing today. So we've got to get better reporting, and then crucially, we've got to get this investment up, and we've got to start getting policies in place that can crowd in this investment as well. And that's where the opportunity is for politicians to really lead this year. And I think many voices, many people are going to be looking to politicians for leadership and indeed to business and to other sectors to step up. And now is our chance to do that.
This is the first in what is set to be a series of annual reports. What would you like to see in the next one in 2022 when we talk again?
Well, I think, as I said, as we found it very difficult to pull a lot of the data together. And so transparency and reporting and common metrics, I think getting that in place is going to be crucial so that we can actually start tracking this over time. So that will be one big thing. But then, by next year, we need to see a sizable amount of the post-COVID stimulus going into a green recovery so that we can actually start to say our investment into nature positive activities, into these nature-based solutions is starting to really go up. And again, there's examples all around the world that we can point to that we now need to take to a much, much bigger scale, and we need to see replicated all around the world.
Justin Adams, a Director of Nature-Based Solutions at the World Economic Forum, many thanks to you for joining us on The Agenda.
Thank you so much.
Well, as we've heard, private companies are currently not exactly pulling their weight in terms of investing in nature-based sustainable solutions. So what more could they and should they be doing? Well, they could perhaps speak to my next guest, Armen Dallakyan, Director of Sustainable Finance Consulting at KEN Associates. Armen, first of all, explain a little more about what exactly a sustainable finance consultant does.
Yeah, Stephen, it's a very good question. Well, actually, sustainable finance is a very broad area of expertise. And what, in fact, sustainable finance advisors do is to engage and work with governments, businesses, banks, investors, NGOs, etc., with the final goal of promoting investments in sustainable activities to channel existing and future capital flows to businesses that generate positive outcomes for the environment and society. So some of these examples that I can bring is helping companies to put together projects for renewable energy financing, for preventing deforestation, for restoring peatlands, etc., etc. So it's a broad area, and different companies in this area have different roles to play.
So as countries are set increasingly tough green targets, is that having an effect on your business, and are companies getting perhaps more interested in sustainable investments? And do they get or understand their role in saving the planet from disaster, do you think?
Of course, a lot has to be done, but we see that there is a clear shift, especially in the past 1 year, in this area, and there is a growing awareness of the need that more has to be done for the planet and people. So we have a positive trend. And some of the changes actually happening because of this tidal wave of new regulations that is happening across the world in the United States, in Europe, in China, and many other countries, where banks, asset managers, businesses are to pay more attention on environmental and social issues, and as such, direct a lot of their resources to solving the outstanding issues. And I can give you the example, for example, what happened last year for the oil industry. So you probably heard about the cases on Royal Dutch Shell and ExxonMobil, where some initiatives originated by minority shareholders, NGOs, etc., they forced these companies to change their actions regarding carbon emissions, as well as the overall pace of decarbonization of their activities.
In other words, the companies are beginning to listen to their shareholders. But as you were saying there, there's also, and we heard earlier in the show, quite a substantial divide between the amounts companies are investing in sustainable futures and the amount governments are investing in sustainable futures, isn't there?
It's a good point. Well, if you look at the broad area of sustainable finance, here private capital actually is dominating. So more funding is going from private sector than public sector. But if we talk specifically about nature-based solutions, then yes, indeed, this is the case. Around 80% of funding for nature-based solutions is going from the public sector. And there is a strong need for accelerating private sector's engagement in this area. So what can be done in this area is to create incentives and make sure that the interests of the private sector and the public are aligned, so that more capital can go from private companies to projects that tackle environmental issues through nature-based solutions. And these solutions require great engagements of governments, private sector, as well as multilateral development banks and NGOs.
And is this an area that you think is truly global, or do you see it emerging in developed markets, perhaps more swiftly than in emerging markets?
Now, if we're talking about nature-based solutions, I think this is this is a global issue. Obviously, nature has to be preserved everywhere. What we see in terms of actions in individual countries, the United States and China are leading here in terms of the volume of private sector investments in nature-based solutions. But what we have to do is to make sure that policymakers in other emerging developing countries, they are also taking faster actions. And also it is important that developed countries and multilateral development banks, they provide necessary assistance, both technical and financial assistance for these to these countries to develop such solutions.
Armen Dallakyan, many thanks to you for joining us on the agenda.
Thank you, Stephen.
Of course, while government spending on green solutions far outweighs that of the private sector, there are companies for whom sustainability is already at the very heart of their business. One such is energy company CLP Holdings, and its CEO, Richard Lancaster, joins me now from Hong Kong. Richard, tell us more about CLP, the group, and exactly what you do.
Well, we're in the electricity business. We have been operating in Hong Kong for 120 years. And over that time, we have not only become the largest electricity provider in Hong Kong, but we also operate in Australia, in India, and throughout Southeast Asia. We are the largest foreign investor in China and in India in the electricity sector. And we operate around 20% of the electricity supply in Australia's national electricity market. We've been focused on sustainability, and I think the main driver for us was an awareness of climate change. And this goes back to the early 2000s when we saw that our business at the time was heavily dependent on coal-fired electricity generation. And frankly, that is not sustainable in a zero-carbon world.
Tell us more about the measures, the sort of measures you take to ensure that every part of your business is truly sustainable.
Well, you really have to integrate sustainability and make it part of your business. It's not something which is just there for external reporting and just there for show. It really has to be core to your strategy. You have to build your governance around sustainability. We, for example, have a dedicated sustainability committee, which is a board committee that's chaired by myself. Sustainability is core to our strategy, to our business operations, and importantly in our communications to our stakeholders. An electricity business has so many varied stakeholders. We cover every aspect of society from individuals through to large corporations, both large and small. So we have a variety of stakeholders. And that communication is so important. As we were making a transition from fossil fuel generation towards renewable energy, this is coming at a time when, for our investors, renewable energy was seen as being a very high risk, very uncertain investment, whereas coal-fired fossil fuel generation was seen as much more certain and provided greater returns. So we had to do a lot to educate our investors, to take them on that journey.
You have to persuade your investors. A lot of companies are having to persuade their shareholders to go green. What made you decide this was the right path to take? Because you must have encountered a lot of opposition.
I wouldn't say we encountered a lot of opposition, but we had to do an enormous amount of work to show our stakeholders that this was the right thing for our business. And essentially it came down to a way of looking at risk in our business. If we were to maintain the way our business was heading, we would have faced a risk of inability to attract finance. We're basically out of line with where our customers wanted our business to be. And when you started to understand that risk, it was a relatively easy conversation with our investors that in continuing to invest in fossil fuel generation may give you better returns today, but those returns are really at risk and we're not going to be sustainable. So by showing our investors that we had a better alternative for the future, now that was a difficult conversation when returns on renewable energy were much less than returns on fossil fuel generation. But what we could show is that the risks were much less as we moved forward, and so that those returns were actually a much less risky return than what appeared to be a higher return with fossil fuel investments.
Did you have support from government, or was this purely a corporate decision? Because what I'm getting at, as you know, is it has to be a partnership between the corporate sector and governments around the world if they're going to move forward faster towards sustainability.
That's absolutely right. And it was one of the lessons we learned very early on, that we couldn't take a view on sustainability without engaging our governments and our regulators in each of the markets in which we operate. Now, that is something that has effectively slowed us down. We could have moved more quickly, I think, as an organization. But when you consider that we, in some of our markets, have a retail base, we sell electricity to customers. And in making an energy transition, you can't afford to let the lights go out. You can't afford to let electricity prices become unaffordable. And so there is an obligation there to make sure that you've looked after that retail market. And we work in harmony. When we're working with regulators, we have to work at the same pace. So we cannot go faster than our regulators or government policy would allow us. Equally, we can't move slower. So we have to work at the same pace. Now, that doesn't mean that we sit and wait for policies to develop. We're very active in working with governments and trying to bring them along. In some cases, we're able to move very quickly when there is a shift in policy. And I will give you an example recently with in Hong Kong. Our chief executive has announced an ambition for Hong Kong to be carbon neutral by 2050. So we've been able to respond very quickly and lay out a plan that we can discuss with government to say, well, this is how it can be done. So being prepared, working with government enables us to move together at the right pace. And we are often in the case where we're pushing that a little bit and trying to move a little bit more quickly.
That's good to hear. Richard Lancaster, many thanks to you for joining us from Hong Kong on The Agenda.
Thank you.
And that brings us to the end of another edition of The Agenda podcast. Remember, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher and Spotify. You can also find us on CGTN Europe, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and YouTube. And we'd love it if you could leave us a rating and a review. Until next week, goodbye.
The most interesting questions.
Are there other living beings beyond Earth?
Will man or machine be in charge?
Great question.
Always have more than one answer.
Well, hold on, let me just draw up a list.
And always come from more than one person.
That's where the credibility lies.
The concept of having a machinery which is alive and evolving didn't wait for us.
The end of inequality of incomes and wealth around the world, can you imagine how difficult that is at the moment to achieve?
Every episode, Stephen Cole, Murray Beveridge, and some of the brightest minds out there shed light on the answers to some of the most intriguing questions.
There are two ways of looking at this.
Machines can't really discriminate between civilian and military targets.
The Answers Project.
Maybe we need to just look at this in a bit more detail.
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
The Answers Project, a new podcast from CGTN Europe.